The bookstore. So, I've never really been a believer in ghosts or anything supernatural. I'm a pretty down-to-earth person, always trying to find logical explanations for weird occurrences. But what happened to me a few months ago changed that completely. It all started with an old novel I picked up at a secondhand bookstore that I was browsing through a small, dusty bookstore downtown, one of those places with narrow aisles and stacks of books piled haphazardly. I love places like that, where you can spend hours just flipping through old volumes and finding hidden gems. That day, I was searching for something interesting to read when I came across a leather-bound book with no title on the spine. The cover was worn and faded, but it had an intriguing, almost eerie feel to it that I flipped it open and saw it was an old novel, published in the early 1900s. The pages were yellowed and delicate, and the typeface was old-fashioned. I couldn't find an author's name or any other identifying information besides the title, The Shadows Beneath. I was intrigued, so I bought it for a few bucks and took it home. That night, I settled into bed and decided to start reading. The story is about a man who moves into an old house and starts experiencing strange occurrences, things moving on their own, eerie noises, and shadowy figures. It was a classic ghost story, but what made it unsettling was how closely it mirrored some of the things I've been experiencing lately. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. I'd been hearing strange noises in my apartment, soft whispers and creaks at odd hours. I'd also found things out of place like my keys or books shifting on their own. But I hadn't thought much of it, attributing it to stress or my imagination. As I continued reading the novel, the events in the book began to get eerily similar to my own experiences. The protagonist started seeing shadowy figures in the corners of his vision, and the noises grew louder and more persistent. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just a creepy book playing tricks on my mind. The real trouble started on the third night. I was reading the book in bed, and as I got to a particularly tense part where the protagonist confronts a shadowy figure in the mirror, I noticed something odd. The temperature in my room dropped suddenly, and I felt a chill run through me. I glanced up at my bedroom mirror and saw a shadowy shape moving behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, the shadow was gone. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild, but the incidents kept escalating. The whispers grew louder, and sometimes I'd hear footsteps behind me when I was alone in the apartment. One night, I woke up to find the book lying open on the floor, pages fluttering as if someone was flipping through them. I started getting more anxious. I began to worry that the book might have some connection to the disturbances I was experiencing. So, I decided to research it. I went back to the bookstore and asked the owner if he knew anything about the book. He didn't know much, but mentioned that it had been in the shop for as long as he could remember and had come from an estate sale of an old house in the area. I looked up the estate sale and found that the house had a tragic history. It had once belonged to a family who had all died under mysterious circumstances. Rumor had it that the house was haunted, and people had reported strange occurrences similar to what I was experiencing. My unease grew as I connected the dots. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to visit the house. It was an old, dilapidated mansion on the outskirts of town. The windows were boarded up, and the garden was overgrown, giving it a desolate, eerie appearance. I wasn't sure what I hoped to find, but I felt like I needed to understand the connection between the book and the house. As I explored the property, I found an old, rusted key hidden under a loose brick in the garden wall. It looked like it belonged to an old lock. I followed my intuition and used the key to unlock a small door in the basement of the house. Inside, I found a dusty, dark room filled with old furniture and personal belongings. In the corner of the room, there was an old writing desk with a drawer that was slightly ajar. I opened it and found another copy of the novel, The Shadows Beneath. This copy was different, though. It was annotated with handwritten notes and sketches. The notes were frantic, written in a hurried scrawl, detailing the author's descent into madness and his belief that he was being haunted by something he couldn't escape. The more I read, the more I realized that the author had lived in this very house. He had written the novel based on his own experiences with the supernatural. The notes described how the house and the mirror had become a conduit for dark forces, and how the novel itself was a way of documenting his descent into fear and madness. As I read through the notes, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and the whispers from my apartment seemed to echo around me. I could feel a presence, something intangible but undeniably real. The sense of dread was overwhelming. I knew I had to leave. I took the annotated copy of the book and fled the house. Back at my apartment, I decided to get rid of both copies of the book. I burned them in a safe, controlled manner, hoping to put an end to the disturbances. The temperature in the room seemed to normalize, and the whispers and shadows gradually disappeared. It's been a few months since then, and things have returned to normal. The noises have stopped, and the book is gone. I still feel a lingering unease whenever I think about it, and I've become much more cautious about the things I bring into my home. I'm not sure what to make of the whole experience. Was it a coincidence, or was there something genuinely supernatural at play? I don't know for sure, but I do know that sometimes there are things in this world that defy explanation. And for me, that old novel was a reminder that some stories are better left unread. The novel. I used to think I was a rational person. Skeptical of anything supernatural, I prided myself on my ability to dismiss strange occurrences as mere coincidences. That changed when I came across an old novel in a quaint bookstore. It was an antique bookshop, the kind where the air is thick with the smell of old paper and leather, and the floorboards creak underfoot. I was in there browsing, searching for something unique, when I spotted it, a dusty, leather-bound novel sitting alone on a high shelf. The title was barely legible, worn away by time, The Haunting of Eldritch House. The book had a certain aura about it. Its cover was embossed with intricate designs that hinted at something both old and ominous. It was a bit pricey, but I was intrigued, so I bought it. That night, I sat down to read the book. The story was set in a mansion called Eldritch House, which was infamous for its ghostly occurrences. The plot centered around a family that moved into the house and was tormented by an unseen entity. As the novel progressed, the events became more chilling, disembodied voices, strange shadows, and objects moving on their own. I found it well written but dismissed it as just a good ghost story. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen in my own apartment. At first, it was small things. My keys would go missing, and I'd find them in odd places like the refrigerator or the laundry basket. Then, the sound started, soft, echoing footsteps that I could never quite locate. I shrugged it off, attributing it to stress or maybe just an overactive imagination. One evening, as I was reading The Haunting of Eldritch House, the atmosphere in my apartment changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a cold draft swept through the room. I glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight, and I was alone. As I turned back to the book, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, more persistent. The scratching continued for several nights, each time growing more intense. It was as if something was trying to get my attention. I started to feel uneasy, especially when I noticed that the book was moving on its own. Sometimes, when I left the room, I'd come back to find it open to a different page, or worse, closed when I knew I had left it open. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to investigate the book's origins. I did some research and discovered that The Haunting of Eldritch House was based on a real estate transaction and a series of documented events at a mansion by the same name. The house was located in a small, forgotten town about an hour away from where I lived. It had a notorious reputation, and many claimed it was haunted by the spirits of those who had died under mysterious circumstances. Intrigued and a bit apprehensive, I decided to visit the town and check out the mansion. It was a sprawling, decrepit estate with broken windows and an overgrown garden. The air around it felt heavy, as if the house was holding its breath. I could see why it had such a reputation. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. The mansion was locked tight, but I managed to find a way inside through a broken window. The interior was just as unsettling as the exterior. Dust-covered furniture and cobwebs adorned every corner. The air was thick with an old, musty smell. I wandered through the house, feeling a sense of dread growing with each step that I came across a library filled with old books and documents. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Among the piles of dusty volumes, I found a familiar sight, the same leather-bound book, The Haunting of Eldridge House, but this one was different. It was annotated with handwritten notes in the margins, detailing experiences similar to my own. The notes described encounters with strange figures, cold spots, and mysterious sounds. One note caught my attention: the house is alive. It feeds on fear and despair. The book is a gateway. Beware the mirror. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had a mirror in my apartment, one I had inherited from a family member. I'd never thought much of it, but now I wondered if it was somehow connected to the disturbances I'd been experiencing that I decided to head back home and investigate the mirror. When I arrived, I noticed something odd. The mirror's surface seemed to have a faint, swirling mist, even though the room was well lit. I approached it cautiously and began to feel an inexplicable sense of unease. I tried to ignore it and moved the mirror to a different spot in the room, hoping it might alleviate the strange sensations. That night, the disturbances escalated. I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing and muffled whispers. I looked around, but there was no one there. The mirror seemed to be the epicenter of the activity. Every time I looked into it, I saw fleeting shadows and distorted reflections. I could feel a presence watching me, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in paranormal phenomena. I showed him the book and the mirror, and he took a deep interest. He told me that mirrors were often used in rituals and were believed to act as gateways between worlds. He advised me to perform a cleansing ritual to remove any lingering negative energies. Following his instructions, I prepared for the ritual. I gathered various items: salt, sage, and candles. I performed the ritual, carefully following each step and reciting the incantations. As I did, the temperature in the room dropped, and the whispers grew louder. I could feel an invisible force pressing against me, trying to resist the ritual. By the end of the ritual, the room felt lighter, and the mirror's surface seemed to clear. The disturbances in my apartment gradually ceased, and I felt a sense of relief. I decided to keep the mirror covered and placed it in a storage unit until I could figure out what to do with it. I don't know if the book was a catalyst or if the mirror had its own dark history, but the experience left me shaken. I no longer consider myself a skeptic. Sometimes, there are things in this world that defy rational explanations. And for me, that old novel and the mirror were a stark reminder that the supernatural might be closer than we think. The pages. It was a gray and rainy afternoon when I stumbled into that old bookstore. It was the kind of day that made you feel like time was standing still, and I was in the mood for something to distract me from the dreariness. The bookstore was a small, nondescript shop tucked away on a side street, the kind you might miss if you weren't looking for it. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside, and I was immediately enveloped by the comforting mustiness of old paper and leather. As I wandered through the narrow aisles, I noticed a section of old and rare books. My eyes were drawn to a weathered volume sitting by itself on a high shelf, almost as if it were waiting for me. The book was bound in dark brown leather, and the title was embossed in gold, though worn and barely legible: The Whispering Shadows. I was intrigued. There was something about the book's age and the mysterious aura it radiated that piqued my curiosity. I carefully took it down and flipped through the pages, which were yellowed and fragile. The book was a collection of short stories, each one more unsettling than the last. The illustrations were dark and haunting, depicting eerie scenes and unsettling figures. I decided to buy it. The store owner, an elderly man with a wispy beard and kind eyes, seemed pleased to see someone taking an interest in the book. He even threw in a dust cover for free, saying it was a shame to see such a book get damaged. That night, as I sat curled up in my favorite armchair with a cup of tea, I began to read. The stories were unsettling but captivating, filled with ghostly apparitions and unexplained phenomena. The deeper I got into the book, the more absorbed I became. The stories seemed to draw me in, and I lost track of time. Around midnight, I reached the final story, titled The Shadows That Linger. It was about a family that moved into an old house and experienced increasingly terrifying events. They heard whispers at night, saw shadowy figures, and felt an oppressive presence that grew stronger with each passing day. The story ended with a chilling description of the family's final moments, trapped in the house with the shadows closing in around them. As I finished the last page, a shiver ran down my spine. The room felt colder, and the lights flickered for a moment before stabilizing. I chalked it up to the storm outside and decided to turn in for the night. But sleep eluded me. I lay awake, feeling uneasy, my mind replaying the eerie story. The next morning, things started to get strange. I found that the book had moved from the coffee table where I'd left it to the middle of the living room floor. I was certain I hadn't moved it, and my first thought was that it must have been a trick of the light or my imagination. I put the book back on the table and went about my day. As the days went by, the strange occurrences increased. I began hearing faint whispers, especially when I was alone. Objects would shift positions, and I started finding things in places I was sure I hadn't left them. The book seemed to be the center of it all. I'd often catch it out of the corner of my eye, moving slightly or opening to a new page on its own. That I tried to ignore it, attributing it to stress or an overactive imagination, but the disturbances grew harder to dismiss. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a loud thud from the living room. I went to investigate and found that the book was lying open on the floor, the pages flapping as if someone had been reading it. Desperate for answers, I decided to visit the bookstore again. The store owner was there, and I asked him if he knew anything about the book's history. He looked at me with a curious expression, then nodded slowly. "It's an old book," he said. "I don't know much about it, but I remember that it came from an estate sale of a man who died under mysterious circumstances. People said he was obsessed with the book, and that it had a strange effect on him." My heart raced as I listened. It sounded like a scene straight out of one of the stories from the book. I asked if he had any more information, but he only had a vague recollection of the estate sale and the man's tragic death. With this new information, I decided to do some research. I found records of the man's death. He had lived alone in an old house and had died in what was described as a frenzied state. Neighbors reported hearing screams and seeing strange lights coming from the house. Before he died, that I became obsessed with finding out more. I tracked down the address of the man's house and decided to visit it. The house was located on the outskirts of town, in a secluded area surrounded by overgrown foliage. It looked abandoned, with broken windows and a dilapidated exterior. That I managed to get inside through a broken window. The interior was covered in dust and cobwebs. I searched through the rooms, finding old furniture and personal belongings. In the study, I discovered a collection of books and papers. Among them was a journal, bound in the same dark leather as The Whispering Shadows. I began reading the journal. The entries were filled with ramblings about shadows, whispers, and the feeling of being watched. The author described an increasing obsession with the book and a belief that the shadows in the house were alive, feeding on fear and despair. The final entry was a frantic scrawl, detailing the author's final moments as he felt the shadows closing in around him. As I read, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I heard a faint whisper behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel a presence in the room. It was as if the shadows from the book and the journal had come to life, closing in on me. I fled the house, my heart pounding. I decided to get rid of the book and the journal. I returned to my apartment, packed up the book, and took it to a nearby river. I threw it into the water, hoping to put an end to the disturbances. As I watched it sink, I felt a sense of relief. The strange occurrences in my apartment gradually ceased. The whispers stopped, and the objects stopped moving on their own. It felt like a weight had been lifted. I didn't return to the bookstore, and I avoided old books for a while. To this day, I still don't know what was real and what was imagined. The experience left me questioning my skepticism and wondering if there are things in this world that defy explanation. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can't help but think of the shadows and whispers and the old book that seemed to bring them into my life.